So let us try to find our way through the layers upon layers of dishonesty, obfuscation, gaslighting, and hidden agendas, and try to make some sense out of this. So the Supreme Court of Canada has struck down the mandatory minimum sentence on the possession of child porn. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, a mandatory minimum is the legal minimum that a judge can give a convicted criminal for that particular crime. Like the mandatory minimum for drunk driving, let's say, is 6 months in jail. Regardless of what the judge feels or what he thinks the situations are, he cannot sentence them to less than 6 months. Maybe for murder, it's 15 years. The point is, if they're convicted of a particular crime, they have to do that minimum amount. The judge can sentence them to more. And largely what brought this about was activist judges giving extremely lenient sentences because they viewed crime as not being people's fault. It was the result of social factors. If you look at the UK, it's like the ultimate example of this with the two-tier justice system where people can get longer jail sentences for social media posts than like assault with a knife, and judges will just let people go free based on their background. And particularly in the US, mandatory minimums were brought in to kind of put a stop to this and to ensure that judges would not just be able to let people walk free who had committed serious or violent crimes. And Canada has a similar judicial culture in some ways, so the Conservatives implemented similar mandatory minimums in Canada. However, in doing so, they did a lot of it in an extremely incompetent way, and that's why this is a little more complicated than it looks like on the surface. So, one of the issues that often comes up whenever you're dealing with child pornography laws is there are a lot of cases where they apply that maybe they shouldn't. For instance, when you're dealing with two people who are both underage, like let's say two 16-year-olds are sexting each other, does that might count as child pornography possession depending on where you are. Now, neither of them is a legal adult. They're both the same age. One's not taking advantage of the other from an age perspective, but that still technically counts as child pornography. The other example people might give is that the one of them is 18 years old and the other 17 years old, and they're only actually a couple months apart. And is it really fair that if the 17-year-old sends the 18-year-old nudes, that counts as being like CP or whatever? And should that person be subject to a minimum sentencing? I mean, I guess people just could not send each other nude pictures. That would be one way of dealing with it, but that's not something that I think we really want to consider, because that would be too logical. But they'll bring up those cases, or they'll bring up a case of someone just gets sent a picture without their consent or their knowledge, and then they're in possession of child pornography, and then they're subject to the mandatory minimum. So let's say someone who's underage doesn't like someone who's overage. They text them a nude photo, and then they can say that person has child pornography of them. Now, the person didn't seek it out. They didn't ask for it, but they're able to use that as a way to entrap them. Similarly, you do have cases, and I've seen this with regards to some online stuff, wherein people will mail CP to someone, and then the person theoretically has possession of it because they'll have the envelope with it in it, and so they are like technically guilty of possessing CP because the other person disguised it and sent it to them. Just stuff like that. So those are kind of some of the issues you have when you make these just blanket laws that really don't deal with some of these things, and it's hard to make these points because it is such a sensitive, difficult issue. And I think I'm just going to say, firstly, the Conservatives or whoever implemented this should have written this bill better, so we didn't get into situations like this, and this was not used as a way to overrun the whole thing. Because to honest people, like the people who are intellectually honest, who care about justice and judicial, if the argument is being made, is it really fair for two 16-year-olds who are sexting to both go to jail for child pornography possession? And a lot of people would just say no. And then they'd say, okay, well, should we overturn the law then? And it gets really difficult then, because theoretically, from a judicial standpoint, you get it. But by overturning it, you're opening the floodgates to the bigger issue, which is then judges can just give no sentencing for it, for very much more clear-cut cases where people buy it off of the deep web, or they plant hidden cameras, or they do some other disgusting ways of obtaining it. And so it's just this difficult thing, because on one hand, yeah, the law is flawed. It probably does need to be changed. But agreeing with that, even if it's technically accurate, is really bad optics. It's also, once again, I think it's dishonest. They're not acting in good faith in a lot of cases. So from my understanding, and I looked this up, what the Supreme Court of Canada will do is they are against the entire idea of mandatory minimums. So they will take whatever law has a mandatory minimum, view it in the most obtuse way possible, come up with scenarios wherein it might be unfairly applied, and then strike it down. And this has just been an ongoing thing that they've been doing for well over a decade now. The idea being to eventually get rid of mandatory minimums on everything. And what makes it so insidious is on any individual case, they might have a point. Like here, they might have a point on some aspects of this. Some of the other scenarios they came up with was like, if a drug addict shares drugs with his friends, then that counts as trafficking. Or sorry, no, drug dealing, or somebody carrying a loaded gun, or there's just they'll basically take a law that's a mandatory minimum that's very clearly there for a specific purpose, find a scenario where it might be unfairly applied, and use that as a reason to strike it down. Now, is there reason for striking it down and going after the actual problem with the law itself? I would argue no. I would argue that is the excuse that is used to gaslight people like me and people like a lot of you into going along with this. And this was a big issue that they had on the Supreme Court in the United States, where Scalia would sometimes vote with the activist wing of the court because they would be right in a judicial sense. They would be more consistent with precedent, or in that particular case, they would be right. So he would wind up voting with them, and then in the decision, they would write something completely different. And so they were able to pass judicial legislation that way. And that's how this whole thing works. And this is why the judiciary is such an insidious institution. So my point being, this is part of an ongoing, and they will admit this a lot of the time, way to get rid of mandatory minimums altogether and restore the ability of judges to give whatever sentences they want. Now, the interesting thing is the reason that they are against mandatory minimums is because they are against prosecutorial discretion. So the prosecutor can choose what charge to bring against people. So if he doesn't think that the person sharing the drugs is a dealer, he can just charge them with drug possession and not with drug dealing. But their assumption is that prosecutors are just evil, and they will always pick the harshest sentence and the hardest charge possible. And the only way to save the average person is to just give all power to judges and to remove the ability of parliament or prosecutors or anyone else from having any say in the justice system. Yeah, like here, they picked the example, an 18-year-old received an unsolicited text from a friend that was forwarded from their 17-year-old girlfriend and kept it on his cell phone. Now, he probably shouldn't have kept it on his cell phone, but you get the point. So, like, what they ultimately want is it to be like UK with two-tier justice, where they can give minorities or immigrants or whoever dramatically reduce sentences because of social justice or disparate impact, and give very harsh sentences to people who are committed hate speech crimes or and other sorts of political crimes. And I mean, that's the overarching agenda. You can say I'm paranoid, you can say I'm crazy, but that's very clearly where it is. So that's the problem because, like I said, on this one, they might have a point. The specific scenarios might need, the law might need to be amended to deal with some of these. And they might have a point that maybe prosecutors can be abusive, but I don't think these are good faith arguments. This is about a blanket overall ideology and change to the system. And part of this is it makes me sound like I'm crazy and paranoid by trying to portray it that way, even though there's ample evidence that that's what's been happening. And I mean, that's what happens in the US, that's what happens in basically every country. In the West, it's interesting because in a lot of countries now, the judicial branch is by far the most powerful branch of government. In particular, in the U.S., the Supreme Court basically has absolute power within their specific role. If the Supreme Court declares something, there is no recourse. The Supreme Court could even declare constitutional amendments, I would imagine, unconstitutional if they wanted to. All the president really could do to override them is to just not enforce a ruling, which would cause a constitutional crisis. But no, there's basically no oversight. There's no way to overturn a decision by the Supreme Court. What tends to happen in a lot of countries is, I think this happened in Colombia, and this happened all throughout the world, wherein a bunch of countries tried to put constitutional amendments defining marriages between a man and a woman, and then the Supreme Courts overturned it and legalized gay marriage, despite widespread public opposition, despite no vote being held on it. They did this with abortion and the death penalty. And if you look at a lot of these big, like, social issues, very seldom do they actually get resolved in something like a referendum or an election specifically on the topic. It's almost always some judicial fiat that just comes down, and then there's really nothing you can do about it. So let's look at this G-slur logic. Foy says the majority's decision is a reminder that if Parliament intends to pass a law capturing an extremely wide range of conduct, then a mandatory minimum sentence is going to be constitutionally suspect, as there are people who will fall outside of the normal range. We cannot be sending people to jail for a year if it's not proportional to what they did, Foy said. Adding a hypothetical scenario, a 1-year jail sentence would do more harm to the 18-year-old. Here we go. It also cited a previous decision which said the courts are only one link in the chain of interventions meant to protect society. Furthermore, it said there's no issue between emphasizing the severe harms of sexual offenses against children while finding that mandatory minimum sentences are unconstitutional. It's like, look, guys, it's not about that. It's not about not giving pedos and child pornographers and specific segments of the population who engage in this kind of activity lesser sentences or just letting them off the hook. It's not about that. It's about protecting the 16-year-olds who are sexting each other. Let's see. Oh, okay. So Shakir Rahim, director of the Criminal Justice Program at Canadian Civil Liberties Association. And this is like the thing. So the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, I'm assuming that's like the ACLU, is run by some Indian dude. And they just have control over, they can just come in and announce that we're the captain now. We have control over your country's judicial system. Then again, there's, I think, plenty of swipples who have gotten us into this position. And we're against all forms of mandatory minimum. Let's see here. Angela, says these are not victimless crimes. We just can't pay lip service to the protection of children. Adding she's interested to see whether Parliament will try to craft a new law. I don't want to see what they come up with. Should that happen, there will be a fresh and robust debate. For instance, if Parliament insists on having a mandatory minimum, how does it circumscribe perimeters? We can't have a one-size-fits-all. So once again, did the Conservatives who ever do this fuck up when they wrote the law? Probably. Is the Supreme Court's logic in this particular situation have some merit to it? Probably. Is it about that, or is it about getting rid of mandatory minimums in any attempt to control the judiciary so it can be like Britain, it can just be a free for all? Yes. I mean, that's the short answer. It's not about that. It's about gaslighting you into thinking that it's about good judicial practice or precedent or logical consistencies or stuff like that. So my point is, it's more complicated than just saying it's the court siding with pedophiles. There is maybe an aspect to it, but on the pure legal basis, and I feel bad even saying this, but hopefully you get where I'm going with this. But that's why this whole thing is so insidious, is because someone who's intellectually honest might look at some of the arguments in cases like this and go, yeah, I kind of get where they're coming from, but that's not the reason why they're doing this. That's not the long-term plan. And that's not who is going to be impacted by this. The people who are not going to be punished as a result of this decision are not going to be the teenagers who are sexting each other. It's going to be other segments of the population who I'm sure you know who I'm referring to. But regardless, this is Canada. That's just kind of the country I live in. It's not a serious adult country. God bless everyone. Try to stay safe out there. If you live in Canada, hold your kids a little closer because, well, for obvious reasons. So, God bless.